Why does my son keep asking for the engineer? Commander Vale-Doss said it quietly, but the weight behind those words could have pressured the hull of a deep space carrier. Not the medics, not the palace staff, the engineer. Explain yourself, human. Gareth Lowe had been standing in the docking bay of the Sovereignty vessel Ardent Kin for approximately 4 seconds when the commander found him. He had been hoping for significantly more time before this conversation happened. He had been hoping for, ideally, never. He looked at the small figure tucked against his left side. Solon, 3 years old by Keth-Var equivalent, clutching the front of Gareth's work jacket with both hands and watching his mother with the particular calm of a child who has already decided how things are going to go. Commander, Gareth said carefully, that is a very long story. She looked at her son. Her secondary eyelids, the thin, translucent ones that Keth-Var used in moments of intense focus, slid halfway across her eyes like she was trying to process something her mind kept refusing. Begin, she said. It had started 11 months ago, during the Crevasse Station incident. That was the honest beginning, though the official repair log Gareth had filed afterward made no mention of it, because the official repair log was a technical document, and technical documents did not typically contain the phrase, "and then the child decided I was trustworthy." Gareth Lowe was 29 years old, a Level 2 maintenance technician with the Colonial Engineering Corps, assigned to Crevasse Station on a 6-month rotation. Crevasse was an orbital resupply hub positioned at the edge of Keth-Var sovereign space. One of those places that existed primarily because ships needed fuel and because someone had to maintain the fuel infrastructure. His posting was, in the most charitable interpretation, unglamorous. He fixed things: atmospheric converters, docking clamps, thermal regulators. The things that nobody thought about until they stopped working, and then thought about urgently. He had been 3 weeks into his posting when the cascade failure hit. A micrometeorite strike on the station's secondary hull had triggered a pressure fault in the eastern habitation ring. The fault had cascaded into the thermal system, which had cascaded into the emergency power grid, which had very efficiently cascaded into approximately 60% of the station's automated systems going offline simultaneously. The station's Keth-Var diplomatic crew had scrambled to manage the crisis. The commander herself, Vale-Doss, senior diplomatic officer and liaison to the Colonial Engineering Corps, which was why she was stationed on Crevasse at all, had been in the middle of a 7-hour emergency transmission with the Sovereignty Council when the alarms started. Her security team went to the hull breach. Her staff went to the command systems. Her communications specialist went offline entirely, which was a different crisis. Nobody had arranged care for Solon. Solon was 2 years and 8 months old by Keth-Var equivalent. He was small even for his age, with the characteristic pale gray coloration of Keth-Var young, large copper-colored eyes, and the particular solemnity of a child who has not yet learned that the world is sometimes chaotic and unreasonable. He had been in the diplomatic suite when the power cut. He was still in the diplomatic suite when the emergency lighting failed. He was in the dark, alone, and entirely silent, which was somehow more alarming than crying would have been. Gareth found him because the thermal conduit running behind the diplomatic suite wall was on his repair list, and when he cut through the access panel and swept his work light across the room to check the adjacent systems, he found a small gray child sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, holding a square object that might have been a toy, watching the beam of Gareth's light with the composed interest of someone who has decided that whatever happens next will simply be something that happens next. "Hey," Gareth said, because that was what came out. Solon looked at him, said nothing. "Are you okay?" Solon considered this. Then he held up the square object. Gareth recognized it as a Keth-Var tactile puzzle. He'd seen them before in the station's common areas, small interlocking geometric pieces that the Keth-Var young apparently used for focus and comfort. One corner piece was missing. "You're missing a piece," Gareth said. Solon looked down at the puzzle, then back up at Gareth with an expression that said he was aware of this and had been aware of it for some time and had not yet decided how he felt about it. Gareth set his toolkit down, climbed through the access panel, and sat on the floor. He was not trained in Keth-Var child development. He had no diplomatic experience. He had 2 younger sisters back in Thunder Bay, and a vague, practical understanding of what small people needed, which was mostly someone to sit with them, someone to take their problems seriously, and occasionally someone to make a fool of themselves in a way that was entertaining enough to distract from whatever the problem was. He did not find the missing puzzle piece. He did, eventually, find a small hexagonal washer in his toolkit that was approximately the right size and shape to substitute for it. He handed it to Solon. Solon examined it with the thoroughness of a customs officer. Then he pressed it into the gap in the puzzle. It fit. Not perfectly, but well enough. Solon looked up at him. Gareth said, "Sometimes you work with what you've got." He did not know if Solon understood the words. The Keth-Var young acquired language later than human children, and Solon's standard was limited to a handful of phrases at that point. But something in the sentence seemed to land, because Solon turned the completed puzzle over in his hands with a satisfaction that was recognizable across every species Gareth had ever encountered. They spent the next 5 hours in the diplomatic suite. Gareth worked on the thermal conduit through the access panel, came back out periodically to check on Solon. He learned that Solon found the sound of Gareth's maintenance scanner interesting. The specific low-frequency hum of its diagnostic mode made him tilt his head and touch his own ears, in a way that was so earnestly puzzled that Gareth had to look away so the kid wouldn't see him trying not to laugh. He learned that Solon, when he was engaged with something, made a series of very small, very low clicking sounds that Gareth later learned was a Keth-Var expression of absorbed concentration. He learned that Solon had opinions about the organization of Gareth's toolkit. He kept rearranging the smaller instruments into patterns that meant nothing to Gareth, but were clearly very logical to Solon. At hour 3, Solon fell asleep leaning against the access panel wall, still holding the puzzle. Gareth finished the thermal conduit, noted the repair in his log, and sat back down on the floor next to the sleeping child. He did not leave. He was not sure why he didn't leave. Partly it was practical. The cascade failure was still being managed, and half the station's corridors were locked down. Partly it was that he was tired, and the floor was as good a place as any. Partly it was something less articulable. The specific weight of being the only person in the room, the understanding that leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't justify on paper but couldn't ignore either. When Commander Vale Doss's aide came to collect Solon at hour 6, pale, harried, clearly having just survived something difficult, Solon was awake, seated on Gareth's toolkit case, and in the process of very carefully handing Gareth each of his instruments one at a time while Gareth accepted them with equal ceremony. The aide stopped. Solon looked at his mother's aide, then looked at Gareth, then said, with the careful deliberateness of a child placing words precisely, "Stay." The aide stared. Gareth said, "I think he means me." "I'm aware of what he means," the aide said. Solon held up the puzzle, the completed puzzle, hexagonal washer still in place, and showed it to the aide with the pride of someone presenting evidence. The aide filed a report. Gareth assumed this would be the end of it. He was wrong. In the weeks that followed, the cascade failure was repaired, the diplomatic mission resumed, and Crevasse Station returned to its normal rhythms. Gareth returned to his work. Atmospheric converters, docking clamps, thermal regulators. The unglamorous work of keeping things running. Solon, however, had apparently filed his own internal report, and the conclusion was permanent. 3 days after the incident, Gareth was in Corridor 7, checking a pressure seal, when he heard the unmistakable sound of small footsteps moving with great purpose. He looked up. Solon was crossing the corridor toward him with the focused momentum of someone who has already decided where he is going, and why, his aide approximately 6 steps behind, wearing the expression of a person who has had a very long morning. Solon stopped in front of Gareth, examined him, then held up a new puzzle. Different configuration, no missing pieces this time. "I have to keep working," Gareth said. Solon sat down on the corridor floor and began taking the puzzle apart. Gareth looked at the aide. The aide looked back. Something passed between them that was not quite communication and not quite surrender, but was somewhere in that neighborhood. Gareth sat down. He kept working, running his diagnostic scanner one-handed, while Solon systematically disassembled and reassembled the puzzle at his side. The low hum of the scanner made Solon do the tilted head thing again. Gareth adjusted the frequency slightly. Solon's ears moved. Gareth adjusted it back. Solon's ears moved the other way. It took him about 4 minutes to realize he was doing it on purpose. He looked at Solon. Solon was watching him with those copper eyes, waiting for the next adjustment. "You're testing me," Gareth said. Solon made the absorbed concentration clicking sound. Gareth spent the rest of the morning working one-handed. This became a pattern. Not every day. Solon had his own schedule, whatever diplomatic staff organized for the child of a senior officer, but often enough that Gareth began to anticipate it. He learned which corridors Solon's aide typically took. He began carrying an extra scanner in his kit, the older model with the wider frequency range, because Solon found the range of sounds it produced more interesting. He learned that Solon, when he was uncertain about something, went very still, and that the way to help was not to push but to simply keep doing whatever he'd been doing until the stillness passed on its own. He learned that Solon, when he was pleased, had a particular way of setting his jaw that looked serious but wasn't. That was, in fact, the Keth-Var young version of a smile, the palace staff noticed. Station staff, technically. But Crevasse ran with the formality of diplomatic infrastructure. And everyone noticed everything. Nobody said anything directly to Gareth. They just rearranged around it the way people do when something has been decided that nobody wants to be the one to challenge. His maintenance routes got quietly adjusted so they passed through the diplomatic wing during the hours. Solon was most often there. He found a copy of the Keth-Var Early Language Acquisition Guide, loaded onto his station tablet one morning, source unspecified. He read it, all of it. He was not sure what this said about him, and he did not examine it too closely. Commander Vale Doss had been in continuous crisis management since the Cascade failure. The diplomatic mission she was running was delicate, ongoing, and required her personal attention in a way that left very little room for anything else. Gareth had seen her in passing, a tall, precise figure in the formal dark blue of Keth-Var Command. The silver rank markers at her collar, the kind of controlled bearing that said she carried significant weight and had decided long ago not to let it show. He had not expected to speak to her directly. People at his level did not typically speak directly to people at her level. That was not how the structure worked. He became aware, gradually, that she was aware of him. Not in a way that was said. In the way that a room shifts slightly when someone in authority has registered your presence and filed you somewhere. He did not know what to do with this information, so he kept fixing things. The first time they actually spoke was in the station's observation deck, 3 months into the pattern. Gareth was there at the end of a long shift, not doing anything, just watching the stars, which was something he did when he was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. It was late enough that the observation deck was empty. It wasn't empty when he left. Commander Vale Doss was there when he turned to go, standing at the far end of the deck, not looking at the stars but at the diagnostic panel on the wall, the one that showed the station's real-time system status. She had a cup of something in her hand that had clearly been there long enough to go cold. "Technician low," she said. Not a question, not a greeting exactly. More like an acknowledgement that he was a known variable in a calculation she was running. "Commander," he said. She did not dismiss him. She looked at the system status panel for another moment, then said without looking at him, "My son has learned 6 new standard words in the last month. I am told 4 of them are technical terms for maintenance equipment." Gareth considered his response options. "He has very good retention," he said. "He does." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were the same copper as Solon's, which he had not registered before. They had the same quality of evaluation in them, the sense of being looked at by someone who would remember exactly what they saw. The other 2 words were sometimes and enough. Gareth was quiet for a moment. "I said that to him," he said, "the first night. He was frustrated with the puzzle." "I know," she said. "He shows me the puzzle, regularly." She looked back at the status panel, drank from the cold cup, said nothing else. Gareth stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary and then said good night and left. He thought about that conversation for the rest of the week. He was not entirely sure why. There had been nothing in it, nothing that could be pointed to, documented, filed. Just a woman standing in a quiet room, drinking something cold because she'd been too busy to drink it warm, telling him his words had stayed with her son. The second conversation happened 6 weeks later, in the eastern corridor, when Gareth was halfway up a maintenance ladder and heard small footsteps that were moving wrong, too quick, uneven, the specific rhythm of a child not walking on purpose. He came down the ladder fast. Solon had caught his foot on a deck plate seam and gone down hard on both knees, and he was sitting in the corridor doing that very still thing, jaw set, not making a sound, which was somehow worse than crying. Gareth sat down beside him. Did not say it was okay because it wasn't okay, it hurt, and they both knew it. Checked the knees, scraped, nothing serious. Found the small emergency kit he kept in his top left jacket pocket. He'd started carrying it 3 months ago, had not examined this decision closely, and cleaned and covered the scrapes with the careful thoroughness of someone who has younger siblings and knows what this kind of moment requires. Solon watched the entire process with the focused attention he gave to everything. When Gareth finished, Solon looked at his covered knees, then at Gareth. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead briefly against Gareth's shoulder. Not a hug, not quite. Just a point of contact, a moment of rest, and then straightened up, stood up, and continued walking in the direction he'd been going. as though this was simply an administrative matter that had been processed and filed. Gareth stayed sitting on the floor of the corridor for a moment longer than he needed to. He was not a complicated person by his own accounting. He fixed things. He was good at it. He did not have grand ambitions or interesting history. He had grown up in Thunder Bay, the oldest of three, the one who kept the household running after his parents separated, the one who learned early that reliability was its own kind of worth. He had joined the engineering corps because it was stable, and because he was good with systems, and because there was a specific satisfaction in understanding why something worked and being the person who kept it working. He had not expected, on a diplomatic station at the edge of Keth-Var space, to have a 3-year-old reorder something in him. But Solon's forehead against his shoulder had felt like something being said that neither of them had the language for. Commander Vale Doss found him still sitting there. She had been 2 corridors over apparently, and the aide had sent word. She crouched down to her son's level first, checked the knees, received Solon's composed report on the situation, listened with the focused attention of a woman who gave everything the same quality of consideration, regardless of its scale. Then she straightened up and looked at Gareth. "He is all right, I know," Gareth said. "He handled it better than I would have." Something moved in her expression. There and gone like a system briefly flickering, she said, "He has been learning that." Gareth stood up. She was still looking at him. The evaluation looked but different now, running a different kind of calculation. He had the distinct feeling of being assessed not as a maintenance technician, but as something that did not yet have a category. "You carry a first aid kit," she said. "I have sisters," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very precisely, "Would you join us for dinner?" Technician Low. It was not a question. He said yes. Dinner was quieter than he expected. Solon ate with deliberate concentration, rearranging his food between bites in the same organizational patterns he applied to everything. Vale Doss ate like a person who was used to eating quickly, and had made a deliberate choice to eat slowly, which was its own kind of statement. Nobody said anything particularly significant. It was a meal that lasted 2 hours because Solon kept finding things to show Gareth. A new puzzle, a drawing he had made of the station's cross-section, which was, Gareth noted, surprisingly accurate, a small stone he had found somewhere that he considered important for reasons he had not yet been able to articulate in either language. When Gareth finally stood to leave, Solon stood up too. "He needs to sleep," Vale Doss said. Solon looked at his mother, then at Gareth, then back at his mother. It was not a protest. It was an observation, a comparison of 2 data points, a conclusion presented without comment. Vale Doss looked at her son for a long moment. The look of someone who had managed diplomatic negotiations for 11 years and was being outmaneuvered by a 3-year-old. "Tomorrow," she said finally to Gareth. "If you are available." "My schedule is flexible," Gareth said, which was true, and also the most significant understatement of his professional career. Months passed. The diplomatic mission concluded and was extended. Gareth's rotation ended and was renewed. A request that came through the station's administrative system without explanation, which he did not examine closely because examining it too closely felt dangerous. He learned things about Vale Doss the way you learn things about a place you keep returning to, gradually, in layers. Not because the information is offered, but because presence accumulates into knowledge. He learned that she drank the same cold tea that he'd seen in the observation deck every night, that she had apparently decided at some point that hot tea was a luxury she would return to later, and had never gotten around to later. He learned that she was funny, not in the way you'd expect from the controlled bearing and the rank markers, but in the dry, precise way of someone who had learned to keep a perfectly straight face while saying something that made everyone around her fight, not to laugh. He learned that she had been 19 when Solon's father died, a structural failure on a research station, years before Solon was born, a loss that had made her careful in ways she had not fully untangled. He learned that she read Solon's sleep stories in 3 languages, rotating, because she had decided early that he would grow up fluent, and that the best way to do that was to make language feel like home. He learned that the first time he made her laugh, really laugh, not the controlled almost smile she allowed herself in professional contexts. She looked briefly startled by the sound, like she had forgotten it was something she did. The second time, she tried not to. By the third time, she had stopped trying. One evening, near the end of the second year, they were in the observation deck. The same one, the same stars, the same diagnostic panel she looked at when she was thinking. After Solon had finally fallen asleep. The station was quiet in the way that stations got quiet late. the particular hush of systems on minimal overnight cycles. For a long time neither of them said anything. This had become comfortable. The silence between them had a texture to it now, the specific density of shared context. Then Vale Doss said, not looking at him, "Do you know what I thought about during the first night of the cascade failure?" He waited. "Not the station," she said. "Not the mission." Her voice was level, but the levelness had that quality it sometimes got. Deliberate, the way you hold something carefully when you know it's fragile. "I thought about Solon in the dark. Whether he was frightened, whether there was anyone with him." She paused. "I did not know if there would be." Gareth looked at the stars. "He wasn't frightened," he said. "He was reorganizing my toolkit." She made the sound that was Keth-Var for amusement, low, brief, more felt than heard. Then she was quiet again. After a moment she said, "He is different with you. He's grown up a lot this year," Gareth said. "That is not what I mean." She turned to look at him, and in the observation deck's low light, with the stars behind her and the cold tea in her hand, there was nothing diplomatic in her face. No calculation, no assessment, no controlled bearing. Just a woman, Vale, as he had started thinking of her, only to himself, only carefully, looking at him like something had been decided, and she was seeing the decision clearly for the first time. He grew up this year because he had someone consistent, someone who showed up, someone who treated "I'll be there" as a fact rather than an intention. Gareth did not speak. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said quietly, "You did not have to stay that first night. You stayed anyway." "He was alone," Gareth said. "Yes," she said. "He was." She set down the cold tea, turned to face him fully. "And you stayed, which is—" She paused, and for the first time since he'd known her he watched her search for a word. Not because the word wasn't there, but because it mattered that she got it right. "Not a small thing," she finished. "To me." The observation deck was very quiet. Gareth said. Vale looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, not quite. Recognition, maybe. The particular quality of a word landing where it was meant to. "I didn't stay because of protocol," he said. "And I didn't keep coming back because of the mission." "I know," she said, softly, like she'd known for longer than tonight, and had been waiting for the moment when both of them were in the same place at the same time, saying it. She reached forward and took his hand, the same hand that had fixed a thermal conduit and handed a child a hexagonal washer in the dark and taped up scraped knees in a corridor. A simple thing. The kind of thing that shouldn't carry the weight it carried, and somehow always does. He leaned forward. She met him halfway. When they pulled apart, Vale rested her forehead against his. The same gesture Solon had made in the corridor, the point of contact that meant something that didn't have a word in either language. She laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, and the sound of it was the best thing he'd heard in 2 years. They were married 8 months later. The ceremony was a hybrid form, part Keth-Var sovereign right, part colonial registry, something that the administrative staff had apparently spent 4 months figuring out and were very proud of. Solon, who was 4 by then, attended in formal Keth-Var ceremonial colors and spent the entire proceedings standing between his mother and Gareth with the focused gravity of a senior official overseeing a merger he had personally brokered. The station staff found this charming. The Keth-Var delegates found it appropriate. Vale Doss found it, she told Gareth afterward, exactly right, because Solon had been right about everything else, and it would have been strange if he'd been wrong about this. The official record of the colonial Keth-Var cooperative agreement, signed 14 months after the ceremony, describes it as a landmark diplomatic achievement. It cites the groundwork laid by Commander Vale Doss's mission. It references the 11-year negotiating process, the trade structures, the joint research protocols. Historians studying the agreement write about the political conditions that made it possible. They cite precedents, analyze strategy, debate the structural factors. What none of those accounts fully captures is that the negotiating process did not begin with diplomats. And it did not begin at a table. It began with a pressure fault on a secondary hull. It began with a maintenance technician climbing through an access panel and finding a child in the dark. It began with a hexagonal washer that was approximately the right size and shape, and a 3-year-old who examined it like a customs officer and decided it was good enough. It began with a small hand holding a completed puzzle, with cold tea in an observation deck, with a forehead against a shoulder in an empty corridor, with the understanding learned early and held carefully that showing up is not a neutral act, that being the person who stays is a choice, and that choices have weight. Solon, now grown, has been asked in several interviews what he remembers about the early years on Crevasse Station. He always answers the same way. He remembers the sound of the maintenance scanner, The low hum, the frequency shifts, the particular note that meant someone was paying attention. He remembers the puzzle with the hexagonal washer, which he still has. He remembers that when he was frightened, there was someone on the floor beside him. He does not remember being alone. That was the point.